My name is Monica Kramer, and the idea for this day was prompted by a continual nudge from what I believe to be the Holy Spirit. Like the name implies, today we'll focus on grief, suffering, and salvation. Initially, the idea was to help people understand grief and to heal from the loss in their life. As our team met, it became clear that although that was an important part of the plan, the theme of suffering and salvation were necessary to complete the entire picture. So that epiphany of seeing the light has led the team to extend the theme to a journey of faith, grief, suffering, and salvation. I would like to begin by extending a thank you to Father Josh for hosting this event, contacting the local funeral homes, Carpenter Memorial, Odine Colonial Chapel, and Adams and Swanson. Also, thank you, Father Josh, for being present on Newsmakers last Thursday. We also appreciate you allowing your office staff secretary, Robin Garlett, time to design and print materials. Another thank you is extended to Father Seeker, who will share his knowledge on the topic of suffering, as well as his spiritual insight and guidance to me in the planning stages of today's event. Also, thank you, Father, for sharing some of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton's equipment and your technological expertise. Also, a big thank you goes out to St. Patrick's Parish nurse, Brenda Cannell, who was instrumental for our team to secure media coverage, food preparation, ordering of materials, plus a host of other things. Brenda, are you here? She'd probably be busy. Okay. Thanks to Chuck and Angie Fisher for welcoming people this morning. Our very dedicated team, who will very courageously and humbly share personal parts of their lives in this public setting, are to be extended a huge thank you. Two of the speakers who will talk this morning watched a loved one suffer through a length of time before dying. And two of the speakers who will talk this afternoon were blindsided by a sudden death of their loved one. Please allow me to introduce them. So Father Josh Brown will be talking about his personal experiences of grief and also how he has assisted others through the grieving process. And this afternoon, Father Seeker will talk about suffering and the redemptive power of suffering. Mariah Eichhoff will be speaking from the perspective of losing her dad. And I will be speaking from the perspective of losing my husband, Randy. Karen O'Connor will speak from the perspective of losing her sister. And Romano Polanco will be speaking from the male perspective of losing his wife. We are extremely honored that you have chosen to spend the next 4 hours with us. Everyone here has experienced some loss in your life. That is part of the human condition. And we are saddened and sensitive to the hurt and pain that you are bringing here today. We have placed Kleenex boxes on the tables, and we believe tears can be a gift from God. One of the saints said that tears are prayers. Go ahead and cry if you need to or if you want to. At times we may cry with you or cry for our own loss. Some of our feelings are raw. Tears are welcome in this place. Perhaps today you will be thinking of your grandmother or grandfather, a parent, a spouse, a daughter-in-law, a son-in-law, or perhaps a friend or colleague or someone else. You might be thinking of some other loss. Some say time heals, and for many of us that is true. However, there are no rules for grieving, and there are no predetermined guidelines or rules. Grieving is as unique as our fingerprints. Yours are not like anyone else's. So today, 4 speakers who I have already introduced will be speaking about grief for a person who has died and who has been very close to them. They will share with you some of the things that have helped them through their journey of faith. A free lunch will be served and more speakers will talk this afternoon. Our goal is that you will find some relief from your pain and even leave with joy and optimism as you long to see your loved one face to face. And another hope is that you will come to know about the redemptive power of suffering and how much God desires for you to have eternal life. So the agenda for today will be a presentation on grief. We're going to talk about the stages of grief. Father Josh Brown will then speak. We'll see a video by Father John Ricardo. Father Seeker will talk about some holy cards that we have for you. And we'll have a break. Then Mariah will be our first speaker, followed by me as the second speaker. We'll enjoy lunch together. And Karen O'Connor will speak after lunch. And then Romano Palanca will speak, will be our 4th speaker. Father Seeker will give an overview on suffering. And then we'll end with a closing at near 2 o'clock. Mariah and I are both licensed independent mental health practitioners. We have worked in clinical settings as well as school settings. We have worked countless hours helping people through the pain of loss. As evidenced by the PowerPoint slide, there are many kinds of losses. This list is certainly not a comprehensive list. We have brainstormed some of the issues we've helped clients work through in counseling. We'll read through them quickly, and we can talk later if you desire more explanation. Some of the things that Mariah and I have worked with in a clinical or school setting have been the death of humans or pets. Divorce is certainly a loss. Loss of a job. People may come to us with empty nest syndrome, grief, children leaving the home, bankruptcy, another loss, retirement, loss of a home, loss of a dream, loss of a limb or a body part, inability to conceive a child. So I'd like to talk about just a little bit about the stages of grief. The world has 7 stages of grief. The famed author, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, noted 5 stages. They are helpful and are known to many of us. Because of their importance, we are going to review them and briefly describe each stage. Although they are listed here in an orderly fashion, in reality, they are at times messy and disorderly. Sometimes people get stuck, and sometimes their grief journey causes them to start and stop and then start all over again. Fortunately, Almighty God has not created compartmentalized stages, but surely wants us to know that when we are most sad, lonely, depressed, hopeless, angry, and feel we have lost our way, it is then that He carries us. Our brief explanation of these stages include initial paralysis at hearing the bad news. That is shock. Denial is when we are trying to avoid the inevitable. Anger is frustration outpouring in bottled up emotions. Bargaining is seeking in vain for a way out. Depression is the final realization of the inevitable. Testing, seeking realistic solutions. And acceptance, finally finding the way forward. So Mariah's going to talk about 5 of these at this time.
So of the 5 stages that we are going to review a little bit further, the first is denial. It helps us to survive the loss. In this stage, the world becomes meaningless and overwhelming. Life makes no sense. We are in a state of shock and denial. We go numb. We wonder how we can go on, if we can go on, or why we should go on. The second stage is anger. Anger is a necessary stage of the healing process. Be willing to feel your anger, even though it may seem endless. The more you truly feel it, the more it will begin to dissipate, and the more you will heal. There are many other emotions under anger, and you will get to that in time. But anger is the emotion we are most used to managing. The third stage is bargaining. Before a loss, it seems like you will do anything if only your loved one will be spared. We become lost in a maze of if only or what if statements. We want life returned to what it was. We want our loved one restored. We want to go back in time. Guilt is often bargaining's companion. The if onlys cause us to find fault in ourselves and what we think we may have done differently. The fourth stage is depression. After bargaining, our attention moves squarely into the present. Empty feelings present themselves, and grief enters our lives on a deeper level, deeper than we ever imagined. This depressive stage feels as though it will last forever. It's important to understand that this depression is not a sign of mental illness. It is the appropriate response to a great loss. And finally, acceptance. Acceptance is often confused with the notion of being all right or okay with what has happened. This is not the case. Most people don't ever feel okay or all right about the loss of their loved one. This stage is about accepting the reality that our loved one is physically gone and recognizing that this new reality is the permanent reality. We will never like this reality or make it okay, but eventually we can accept it. We learn to live with it. It is the new norm with which we must learn to live. At this time, I'd like to invite Father Josh Brown up to discuss his personal experiences with loss and grief.
Some of my helpers will be handing out some of these handouts. I'm one of those teachers or people that I feel like if I hand it out beforehand, everybody's going to know everything I'm going to talk about. We'll all look ahead and figure everything out, and I don't even have to say anything. I'll just say, let's be quiet and read the paper. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some, very different area of grief and loss in my own life. And I know so many of you have a deeper loss, a deeper grieving that you have had to go through, be it with losing a loved one. In a very unique way, I think it's pretty unique in my situation. All of my grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, relatives are still alive. I'm almost 45. This coming Thursday, I'll be 45 years old, and everybody's still alive. We've been very blessed in my family. And so when this grief conference came along, and Monica invited me to be a part of this and to have us have this conference here, I thought to myself, what am I doing here? Why am I asked to talk about grief and suffering? Other than as a priest, as a pastor, we deal with this on a regular basis. I was just saying earlier, we have here at St. Patrick's and in the surrounding churches that we're trying to cover right now, 4 funerals in 5 days. And to sit with those people and to meet with those people, to meet with many of you that I have met with before funerals and things is a very powerful thing in my life. But I thought to myself, one of the probably most recent things that I probably am still grieving today, that is another level of grieving, and not in losing someone, but kind of in the sense of losing someone, is an experience that probably only a priest can experience. And that is the experience of leaving a parish and going to another parish. Now, some people might think that's a great thing, like, whew, I'm done with that. Fresh start, right? But it's difficult because as a priest and you don't have a wife and children, the parish become your family. They become your closest friends. They become the people that you spend the most intimate moments of life with, right? You're with them at the funerals. You're with them at the birthdays and the baptisms and the weddings, and you share life together. Well, 2.5 years ago, when I was assigned in Ord, Nebraska, someplace that's been in the news a little bit in the last couple of days, unfortunately, very unfortunately, but I was assigned in Ord, Nebraska, and I was my first pastorate. I'd only been there for 3 years, and I got a phone call on a Saturday afternoon, and Bishop Hannafelt said, Father Brown, I'd like you to pray about being moved to North Platte, Nebraska. And I was kind of shocked. Only after 3 years, normal assignment for a priest is about 6 years. So it really caught me off guard. And he said, no, just pray about it. I'll call you in a couple of weeks and kind of see how things are going. Well, needless to say, I went into confessions and Mass. I don't remember anything happening. And I remember after Mass this overwhelming sense of loss. This overwhelming sense of grief. And I fell on the floor in the chapel in my house. And I cried and cried and cried, because the realization came to me that I was about to lose my closest friends, that I was about to lose my family, these people who had brought me in and loved me as my first parish as a pastor. And so eventually I started to pray through that, and that's when I gave you guys what I think is probably one of the most helpful things for me. And in my work as a spiritual director and working with people in grieving and trying to help them on the spiritual side of grieving, is I handed out this little sheet, and it's really about ARRR. And I like it because it's so easy to remember. I have it written in my Bible, I have it written in my prayer book, I have it written in different places, just to remind myself of the importance of ARRR and how important that is in healing. And so what happened when it was announced that I was going to be leaving North Platte, or leaving Ord and coming to North Platte, is I had to become aware of the feeling of loss, So I think sometimes, even as I met with families yesterday for a funeral that's coming up next week, sometimes I think right when we first experience the loss, when the loss is really fresh, we're not aware of everything around us. It's kind of like we're living in this twilight zone, right? I'm sure many of you know. It's hard to comprehend everything and to be aware of everything that's going on inside of us, because we're just dealing with the things we have to deal with, right? Yesterday I'm talking with a wife, and she can't think outside of anything other than these immediate plans for the funeral for next week. But I'm aware, and I pray that she becomes aware of what's going on inside of her in the midst of all of this. So what's extremely helpful is to become aware of what is going on inside of us, and sometimes that happens later on. So it was 3 months until I actually had to leave Ord, and so I was still becoming aware of all of these emotions of losing my family, in a sense. Being torn away from my family and knowing that I'll never be sent back to this place again. That I'm not going to be as intimately a part of the family that I've been in this family for 3 years. That have loved me and brought me into this. So becoming more and more aware. And then what I realized what was so important is that I needed to relate this. I needed to relate this to someone and to God especially. I needed to relate this to God. Whatever I become aware of is going on inside of me. We know those, all of those thoughts, feelings, desires that are going on inside of us. You know, a feeling of loneliness, a feeling of I'm gone, they don't love me anymore, all these types of things. You know, there's all kinds of feelings and thoughts and desires that will come up in our hearts, and to become aware of those and relate them to God. And that was the most healing part of that, is relating that to God. But then I thought I was kind of done with all of that grieving and all of that relieving of and relating everything to God. And the time came for me to leave Ord. And so I knew I'd come here. I visited with Father Golke here, and it was time for me to leave. And I had my last Mass at my parish. I had a small little school with 55 kids and 5 teachers, just a nice small community. And all the teachers came to my Mass there that last day on whatever it was, June 30th. And there wasn't a dry eye. We couldn't stop crying. We just loved each other so much. And this idea of losing, and this idea of having to say farewell. The next thing I remember was getting in a truck with a trailer full of my things and driving from Ord to North Platte, which, if you don't know, it takes about 2 hours and 15 minutes. And I cried the entire way here. I just couldn't stop crying. And I finally pulled over, kind of out by Mariah's house on the side of the highway over there by the tower north of town. And I just said, all right, come on, Josh, you got it. You can't walk into the office showing these people in this new parish how much you hated leaving the old place, because they're looking forward to you. But I'm sure there was a grieving going on here too, right? And I experienced that people really grieved the loss of Father Jim after 10 years. I've only been here 2.5 years, and I still hear many stories, and people come up and say, well, you know, we were free last weekend, so we thought we'd go up and see Father Jim. And at first, I am aware that kind of shoots a dart at my heart, but then I know they love Father Jim. You love your priest, you love your pastor, whatever church you go to, you fall in love with your pastor because he's there in all those moments. And all of this kind of really became real for me on that drive from Ord to North Platte. And I realized that third step there is that I needed to receive from him. I acknowledged that there was something going on in me. I related all of my feelings, thoughts, feelings, desires to him, but I also needed to receive from him that consolation. I also needed to receive from him affirmation that I am loved here in a new place. Affirmation from him that I'll have just as much beautiful memories and family and people to love here than I did in Ord. In fact, 4 times as many people here as I did in Ord. So many more people. But I had to receive. I had to let myself receive. And I think that's an important part for all of us. As we acknowledge what's going on in us, and we relate it to God, please God, and we relate it to friends, which is another aspect of gathering all of us here today, to be able to talk with others and relate to others. But then to be able to receive. To place ourselves, and I call it a posture of receptivity. To be in a place in our lives that we're ready to receive. To receive God's grace. To receive God's love. To receive what we need to go on from God the Father, the Almighty Father, who has so much love and consolation to give to us. And to rain down upon us in our prayer life, if we're able to relate that to him and then receive. And then finally we respond. The last step there is to respond with trying to move forward in life. And that's difficult, right? Trying to move forward. But after I got here and I unpacked my bags and I moved into the rectory and to spend the first evening kind of unpacking in the office. And anybody that knows me knows that I can't sleep if I've got boxes around. And so I pretty much stayed up until 2 in the morning unpacking so that I could wake up the next day and I'm here. I'm settled. I'm done. I'm ready to go. But that was part of how I had to just kind of respond by, I need to go. I need to move on. And I thought that I was done and that I was moving on. And of course, but we all know that even though we might think that the healing might be done, and we might think our grieving might be done, and our suffering might be done, there are certain times in our life where it comes back up again. There are certain events or certain things that might trigger that grief or that suffering or those memories in our heads again that might almost bring us right back to where we were before. So, I've been here 2.5 years. A month ago, that pastor that replaced me in Ord was Father John Kakrazil from India, was removed from the parish. And he was removed from the parish because we were told that there were struggles with alcohol and depression. And it just hurt, all those feelings of those people that I love, and I'm thinking to myself, they need a pastor. At first my selfishness thinks they need me. And then God reminds me, no, they don't need you. North Platte needs you. But they need the healing and a pastor up there. And then, of course, very sadly, in the midst of just realizing how that hurt me when they lost their pastor, and they've had to have a retired guy and a different guy every weekend, which is difficult. Then 3 days ago, we hear on the news, and we're made aware in the diocese that same priest was accused and arrested of first-degree sexual assault. I tell you, that tore my heart out. All the feelings of love and loss and all of that came flooding back in again. So what did I have to do? What have I been doing for the last 3 days? What did I do for an hour this morning at 5 o'clock in my holy hour this morning? I did just this. I acknowledged that there's a hurt inside of me. I acknowledge that I'm terrified to even hear of who this person is that was assaulted. But I'm also just afraid for them, and they're feeling alone. And I know their feelings, and they're feeling like, who are we going to get as a pastor? So I acknowledged all of this in me, and I related it to God. And I received from Him the great consolation that I need to know that I am where I need to be, that I am blessed here in North Platte, but that God will send them someone to love them and to bring this healing that they need to begin to repair the hurts and the damage that have been done there. And I received that from God, just to continue to receive that so that I can respond by coming here and being able to stand up before you and talk about this hurt that's still very fresh. This wound that I thought had already scabbed and healed over, and sometimes you can kind of still see that scar of maybe on your knee when you fell when you were a kid and broke your knee open, and today you can still see the scar, and I thought it was all scarred over and it was all fine, and today it feels like it's an open, festering, bloody scar again. But in order to go through, in order to continue, this is the process that I use, and this is a process that I feel is the most helpful in the spiritual life, is to acknowledge what's going on in us. No matter how many years it's been since our loss, since our grieving, maybe no matter how long it's been, to acknowledge every day there's something new going on in us. And to acknowledge that. It's real. The thoughts, feelings, desires are real, right? I tell people all the time, you can't argue with feelings. If somebody says, I feel alone today, you can't say, oh, no, you don't. You do. And you can't argue with that feeling. So to take those feelings and acknowledge them and then relating those to God, which is probably one of the most important steps, is just telling God, you know what, I'm alone. I feel alone. I know it's not true because I know you're with me always. Jesus said, I'm with you always, even until the end of time. But I feel alone. And to just acknowledge that and relate that to God, and to receive from Him the love and consolation that He wants to give us. To receive from Him the assurance of our loved ones and that they're being taken care of. Just like these people that I love so much in Ord. And then to respond with our lives and trying to pick ourselves up and move on. Because as we all know, we can't just stay there in that place of grieving. It is a process, as we've heard, but we also have to respond by moving forward and moving on. So I hope and I pray that you'll be able to maybe fold this up and put it in your prayer book, maybe put it in your Bible, whatever is the most helpful for you, or wherever it might just remind you, and then just, if you do like I do, just write those letters A-R-R-R all over the place, to just remind you to acknowledge what's going on inside of you, to receive from the Father to relate to Him, to relate to Him, to receive from Him, and to respond with your life. I think it's been very helpful for me, and so I just really wanted to share that with you today as a means of maybe helping you in the spiritual side of your own grief and suffering. Thank you.
Thank you, Father.
We have some of these are on a table, and we have images or holy cards of the Rosary, different ways to pray the Rosary, great prayer to the Blessed Virgin. We have images of the Blessed Virgin, Our Lady of Perpetual Help, and Our Lady of Grace, and some prayers from the back of those holy cards. We have a prayer to Saint Joseph, the guardian of the Redeemer, patron saint of the dying. A prayer card to Saint John of the Cross, who was with Saint Teresa of Avila, a reformer of the Carmelites. Saint Teresa reformed the female Carmelites, and Saint John reformed the male Carmelites. And we have, I think that's Saint Teresa of Avila. And then Saint Dimphna, special saints that are intercessors. Saint Dimphna is a saint related to mental illness. And Saint Francis of Assisi, who is a special saint for many of us, and his simplicity and his poverty and humility. Pope Francis, our prayer for the Pope, and asking him to lead us in, he's the visible, the Vicar of Christ here on earth.
And born and raised in North Platte, member of St. Pat's here. Also began working at St. Pat's High School this year as a school counselor. Prior to that, I had a mental health private practice, as my mom mentioned. So I just have a lot of experience working with other people through loss. This is, however, is my own personal experiences with grief and loss. I just have to read it, because if I try to say it out loud to you without reading it, I think I will probably fall apart, and hopefully I don't do that anyway. So, my dad's name was Randy Kramer, and he died on October 4th, 2016. This is a picture of he and I at my brother's wedding, which was just not even a year before he passed away. It's a pretty special picture for me. Oops. As I mentioned, my dad, Randy, died October 4th, 2016. He knew he was approaching death well before that, however. In June of 2016, he called me up and proceeded to have what turned out to be perhaps the most difficult conversation of my life. My dad told me that day that he believed he was almost ready to meet Jesus, and that he was ready. He wanted me to try to work towards letting him go, as hard as this would be for me. Through tears, I tried to convince Dad that while I was grateful for his acceptance with this, we still had more treatments to try, more specialists to pursue, more ways to try to save his life. I just could not allow myself to imagine life on earth without my dad. Right before the conversation ended, my dad said these words to me: "Mariah, remember, I am always with you." At the time, I had never known a life without my dad, so I remember thinking, oh, okay, of course you're with me. However, a part of me knew that day that the words, "I am always with you," would soon take on a new meaning. Now, when I am missing him, or feeling sad that he isn't here to be part of our family's events, or just for me to call when I want to or need to, I just imagine hearing him say those words, "I am always with you." My dad was wise, so wise. I believe that he very intentionally chose those words to say to me that day, not just to comfort me at that point in time, as he was asking me to begin to let go of him, but also to carry those words with me throughout my life. so that no matter what, I can feel his presence with me in my heart. I feel my dad most in nature. As a farmer and rancher, he spent much of his time in the great outdoors, breathing the fresh air and loving the land and cattle that he cared for. I don't get to spend as much time outdoors, but when I do find myself there, he feels so close. I take a deep breath, close my eyes, remember his reassuring smile, and imagine his soft voice saying, "I am always with you." We've heard a little bit already today about suffering, so I'll talk a little bit about my dad's suffering. In some ways, I consider myself very blessed that I was able to have that talk that day with my dad. You will hear from people later today that did not have the opportunity to say goodbye or to have time to really absorb what was happening surrounding the death of their loved one. My heart aches for them as I imagine how incredibly painful a sudden and unexpected loss must be. As much as I am thankful for the chance that I had to say goodbye to my dad and the ability to hear him say he was ready to go to heaven, this gift came at a price. My dad endured incredible suffering during the last several years of his life. He came very close to dying in 2012 when our daughter Elise, his first grandchild, was only a few months old. I often think back to that time, and maybe a little selfishly, how much we would have missed out on if he would have died in 2012. He was able to make many, many more memories with our family. He got to see several more grandchildren join our family, including our son Jace, who was only 2 when my dad passed away, but still today talks about his papa all the time. Since my dad's death, however, I have been able to see the other side of this. My dad didn't ever talk or complain much about his pain, but it was obvious to the rest of us. I believe God wanted this suffering for my dad, and that it was a sacrifice God chose for my dad to have. Who knows, other than God, why or for what purpose my dad went through the suffering he did, but I like to think that maybe in part, perhaps it was to give us the gift of a few more earthly years with our dad and papa. I felt extreme guilt after my dad died that we put him through extra pain by taking him to the hospital in Lincoln for the last month of his life. Looking back, though, I believe this was all part of God's plan. God needed all parts of his plan to be complete. While Dad was in the hospital in Lincoln, we finally found out what was at the root of all his pain and suffering. He was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, a rare type of cancer in the plasma of the blood. He fought hard following his diagnosis. However, the cancer was too progressed for the chemo and other treatments to do much good. His body was even rejecting the nutrition that the doctors were trying to give him through various types of tubes. On September 30th, 2016, my husband Josh and I went to visit my dad. He was still trying to fight, I'm sure mostly because we wanted him to. Remember, he was ready for God to take him back in June of that year. While visiting with him that day, I could tell he was rapidly losing energy. He was becoming more and more distant from us and from earthly things. I felt God nudging me to say something to him that day. I said, "Dad, let's take you home." He only replied with one word, "Alleluia." His eyes filled up with tears, and even though my heart was breaking, I knew it was the right thing to do. My dad wanted to die at home with my mom, who he always called his bride, and I needed to set things in motion to make sure that that happened. On October 2nd, 2016, my dad returned to his home on the hill that he shared with my mom and started hospice care. The ambulance crew was gracious enough to stop on the way home for him to have one last view of my brother Nathan harvesting. We have a beautiful video of that experience, and I'm so grateful that we do. On the way home that day, my brother Josh and I were planning some of the details for our dad's funeral. It was so surreal to be doing that, even though he was still alive. The doctors in Lincoln had indicated that we likely had 10 days to 2 weeks before my dad would pass away. My brother Josh said he didn't think my dad would live that long. He thought he would die in only 2 days, October 4th, since it was the feast day of our dad's favorite saint, St. Francis of Assisi. I was a little skeptical because of what the doctors had said, but I knew this would be up to God. We spent a lot of time with our dad over the next couple days. The morning of October 4th, I went up to spend a little more time with him. Mom and I sang him his favorite song, The Prayer of St. Francis. It was such an incredible moment for the three of us, and one that I will always remember. As I was leaving that morning, I saw my dad raise his hand up. This was odd, as he had very little energy at that point and had not made any kinds of motions like that for quite some time. I tried to hold his hand as he had it raised, but he gently pulled it away. I think maybe he was reaching towards heaven, or perhaps heaven was reaching for him. Shortly after I left, I got word that my dad had taken his last breath on earth. There were so many beautiful pieces of his passing. Our ability to say goodbye, hearing him say the words that he was courageously ready to move on to the next life with Jesus and all those that had passed before him, seeing the combine make one last round, his dying on the feast of St. Francis. Soon after, my mom and I could sing him The Prayer of St. Francis, his favorite song. Before the loss of my dad, we never thought about death being associated with beauty, but there certainly was incredible beauty surrounding the death of my dad. Thank you. Make me a channel of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me bring your love. Where there is injury, your pardon, Lord. And where there's doubt, true faith in you. Make me a channel of your peace. Where there's despair in life, let me bring hope. Where there is darkness, only light. And where there's sadness, ever joy. O Master, grant that I may never seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love with all my soul. Make me a channel of your peace. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned, in giving of ourselves that we receive, and in dying that we're born to eternal life.
As Mariah mentioned, her father, my husband, died 2 years ago. He had been sick for a few years and his death was imminent, although we did not know the day or the hour. I often said that marrying Randy was the single most important decision of my life. He was God's greatest gift to me. And from our union were born our 3 children, Mariah, Nathan, and Josh. Our single most important mission in life was to help one another and our children get to heaven and gain eternal life. Our married life was not perfect, but we loved one another deeply. During our marriage, we adopted the number 333 as our special numbers that had significant meaning for us. The 3 stood for Randy, Monica, and God. We knew if God was a part of our lives and we followed his lead, then the rest would fall in place. We were married 38 years when he died, and we had started dating when we were 16. So most of my life, we were together. When Randy died, I thought my heart would break. Every day seemed like a blur. I would like to share a metaphor that describes this time after Randy's death. Being raised on a ranch, I knew fences separated sections of land. They started with a gate, and if you walked or drove far enough, you'd come to another gate. So the story goes. There were once 2 horses who lived their entire life together in a pasture. One day, one of the horses died, and for the next year, the horse that was left behind walked the fence. Just walked the fence. That was exactly like me. And the fence wasn't a white picket fence. The fence was exactly like this barbed wire fence. This is the barbed wire. For the first year after Randy died, I was in a fog, just walking the fence. My faith carried me. God guided me as I clung desperately to the fence. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew if I kept walking, I'd eventually find the gate. I had wonderful friends, like my Sunday night buddy who waited for my invariable calls, or my friend the card lady, who has probably sent me 50 cards since Randy died, or my cleaning lady, who left me messages of strength and hope on my pillow, or Randy's friend, the banker, who soon became my trusted and invaluable friend who led me during the darkest part of my clinging to the fence because of my lack of knowledge in the financial world. During this time of grief, I wanted to stay close to my children, but they were grieving too, and they could not give me comfort and solace because those were the same things they were looking for. Basically, people can't give what they don't have themselves. Even the grandkids grew distant because they never knew if I would randomly start crying or why Papa wasn't sitting in his chair. Before Randy died, I wondered how I would ever go on without him. I asked him many times the summer before he died, "Honey, will you promise me you'll always be with me?" It was a great comfort when he promised me he would. So I want to share 3 specific times that I felt Randy's presence since his death. 2 of those times I captured on camera or iPad, and I will share them with you. The first one is conveyed with just a story and no visuals. There was a time after Randy's death that I felt survivor's guilt. Our 3 children loved their dad. He always had time for them, did fun things with them, and comforted them when they were sad. He never disciplined them. I did. So as Randy's health declined, I could see the great pain it was causing them. He did not want to leave them, and they did not want to let him go. For several months after Randy died, I felt depressed and guilty. I love my children more than life itself, and I have a deep desire to make them happy. So I began to think, how much better would it have been if I would have died first? And Randy would have lived on with them. That thought was with me continually until one day I said to them, I love you all so much, and I'm sorry I didn't die first. They asked why I would say such a thing. And I said, because I know you loved your dad more than you love me, and that's okay. I loved your dad more than I love myself. Our children surprised me. A moment of healing happened. They said, Mother, we love you both. It was just that Dad was always the fun one, and you were the disciplinarian. You were the one who told us no. You were the one who continually reminded us not to do anything illegal or immoral. It was you who checked our breath when we came home. Randy had told me before he died that he felt bad that he had not been a better disciplinarian. I fully understood. He was more like a teddy bear, not a grizzly bear. This open and honest communication with our children opened a door that had previously been closed and controlled by silence that was like an elephant in the living room. If you have an elephant in your living room, I encourage you to name it so you can tame it. This willingness to communicate openly has made all the difference in the world to us. The second time I knew without a doubt that Randy was near was a few days before we buried his cremains. Randy and I had always loved the moon. I sang all the songs to him that I knew, like Moon River as the full moon arched its way each month across the sky. And so when I had his cremains home for 3 weeks before burial, I took him outside and recorded myself singing Moon River one last time. After I sang Moon River, I returned to the house and sat down on our love seat. The ceiling fan began to blink off and on. The presence of Randy was so strong in his office that night. The light has never done this before and after this time. So ask yourself, just how close are the living to the dead? Is that what is meant by the communion with the saints? The third time I knew Randy was keeping his promise to be always near me was last May 2018. I had just gotten out of the hospital after spending 5 days there. I had experienced great suffering, as if a sword was piercing my heart. When I was released by the hospital, I went to the cemetery to be by Randy. It was right before Memorial Day, and I wanted to spend time with Randy. When I drove into the cemetery, I noticed the moon was in the sky. When I got to Randy's grave, I had a mini meltdown. It had been hard to be so sick without Randy by my side. So I reminded Randy, you promised you'd always be near me. Life is hard, so hard. At that time, I picked up my iPad to take a video of the cemetery for my ailing mother, who was not mobile enough to come to the cemetery. And this is what I saw. Please note that it was in 2017 when Dr. Baxter was playing at Randy's burial and watched the balloon release. Some of the balloons were red and circular, and some of the balloons were silver and star-shaped. Now, 1 year later, in 2018, I was using my iPad to capture graves so my mother could see them. And in my viewfinder, this is what I saw. A balloon, exactly like one of the silver balloons from 1 year ago, was flying across the cemetery right in front of my viewfinder. From the St. John's Cemetery in Stapleton. So later, I phoned Siri to find out the wind velocity. Siri said, the wind velocity at most is 2 miles an hour. There would be no way this balloon survived a year through wind, hail, sleet, and snow and emerged all alone in the sky, flying high and rising steadily toward the heavens in a 2-mile-an-hour wind. Do you ever notice the sights and sounds of the what-ifs and the could-it-bes in your life? Keep watching. Miracles are all around us. God is near, and our loved ones are only a breath away. I am so assured that Randy is in heaven. I am also assured he is very near me now. He wants good things for me, just like Christ wants good things for me. I desire to be with God and with Randy. In Randy's memory, I had a waterfall built this past summer. It has Randy's eternity cross in it. And a little boy statue with his eyes fixed on the cross. and a little girl statue swinging her toes through the water. It's a great place to go at night and pray. For me, it's like a little bit of heaven on earth. Please listen as Mariah and her daughter Elise and I join the restful waters of Randy's waterfall as we long to be with him in heaven and for the coming of Christ. There is an urgency for me to get life in order and be mindful of his coming. We want to pass this urgency on to the next generation. This is our faith. This is our hope. This is our legacy. Please notice the rainbow in the sky. The rainbow reminds us God always keeps his promises. We pass on our hope of salvation to our children and our grandchildren, but not only to them, but to the children of the whole world as well. As we sing this song, we will be reminded of our need to pass on the hope of salvation to children everywhere in the world. Some of the words in the song will be in the children's native African language. The translation of the words we'll be singing is, I know a day is coming. That's what the little African children will be singing. I know a day is coming. A day is coming. You will return to get us. I know, a day is coming. Jesus the Messiah. One day, we'll see the King. One day. Soon and very soon.
Soon and very soon, we are going to see the King. Soon and very soon, we are going to see the King. Soon and very soon, we are going to see the King. Soon, hallelujah, hallelujah, we are going to see the King. No more crying there. We are going to see the King. No more crying there. We are going to see the King. No more crying there. We are going to see the King. Hallelujah, hallelujah. We are going to see the King. Hallelujah, we are going to see the King. Should there be many rivers we must cross, there be many mountains we must climb, God will supply all the strength that we need. Give us grace till we reach the other side. And very soon we are going to see the King. Soon and very soon we are going to see the King. Soon and very soon we are going to see the King. Hallelujah, hallelujah, we are going to see the King. Hallelujah, hallelujah, we are going to see the King.
time for lunch. And Brenda, is she here? Can she give us a kind of a flow of the traffic? Mary Ellis will have some books related to grief available for our browsing, but not to purchase. And when you hear the music start playing again this afternoon, please return to your seats, because we've got more people to share this afternoon.
And I'm going to ask Karen O'Connor to come up and share about her healing after the loss of her sister.
Thank you for coming back after lunch. It's a tough act to follow, being after lunch. So what I'd like you to do right now, if you could, is just close your eyes a moment. Everyone close your eyes, please. No peeking, just keep your eyes closed for a moment. Okay, if you can now open your eyes. That's considered your nap. So no napping during my talk. My name is Karen O'Connor, and I live here in North Platte. I grew up in North Platte. My maiden name was Doyle. My parents were Jim and Marge Doyle. And my husband is Tim O'Connor, and I have two sons, TJ and John. They are married, and so we have, right now, 4 grandchildren. I am by no means an expert on grief. I'm not a counselor, and I'm not a therapist. I'm just like one of you. Any one of you could come up and tell your story. We all have a story to share. My sister, Jerry Lynn, passed away unexpectedly a year ago this past November. It was one of those phone calls that no one likes to receive. As Monica alluded to earlier, I was blindsided. When I lost my grandparents and my parents and my in-laws, we were somewhat prepared for their passing. Whether due to illness or aging, we had time to prepare when they passed. By prepare, I mean, it was in the back of our minds. Our parents had illnesses, and our grandparents were quite elderly. There are 5 of us siblings, with my sister Jerry Lynn being number 4 of 5. I have an older brother, then myself, a sister Julie, then Jerry Lynn, and a younger sister Kathleen. So of course I thought we would all grow very old together, and perhaps when we passed it might be in order. But that's not how life went. Life just doesn't work that way. If you look around this room, we are each very unique, and yet we are all exactly the same. With respect to being the same, we have all dealt with grief and loss. We have lost loved ones, yet the way that we are each unique is that we have all dealt with our grief in our own unique way. What I have learned about grief in all aspects, whether it be death, loss of a job, loss of a pet, loss of a dream or a marriage or a divorce, whatever the loss is, that there is only one rule. And that rule is there are no rules. Each of us is unique in how we grieve. We cannot compare. Depending on the loss, of course, everyone has their own way of moving forward. I've seen people lose a job and not be able to find another one because they can't let go of what they lost and move forward. I've seen folks be devastated by a divorce and are never the same. Others have divorced and are right back into the dating game. I have seen friends who have lost a spouse by a death and never get over it, and they seem to get stuck in their grief. I can't relate to the loss of a child, but I have seen friends with the most incredible strength forge on in life after losing their child. I find them so inspiring just by how they have moved forward. Within our own family, we have each dealt with the loss of our sibling differently. My sister Julie was very close to Jerry Lynn. They could have easily been twins. They were just 1 year apart in age, and they were very close. There was a larger age difference between myself and my older brother. As we got older, we did get closer. I think that is fairly common. those sibling rivalries seem to dissipate with time. With Julie, she finds it more difficult in some areas regarding memories. She and Jerry Lynn shared many memories and experiences together, more so than I did. So she misses discussing those memories and those experiences with Jerry Lynn. I do, however, encourage her to tell me about those memories and stories. It is so very important to tell stories and reminisce about our loved ones who have passed on. I never knew one of my grandfathers, nor one of my uncles. They passed away when I was very young. But I grew to know them and to love them just by the stories that my grandmother would tell and my dad would tell of their memory. They would laugh and they would cry when speaking of them. I could feel their love through their tears and their laughter. And I also saw strength in those tears. I witnessed the fact that their lives did go on, even after the great loss of their loved one. When my husband's mother passed away, she was only 54, and she died of leukemia. I noticed that there weren't many stories being told. I don't know if it was the fact that all of her children were men and they didn't like to show their emotion, or the fact that it caused my father-in-law to become extremely sad. And so we didn't talk about it very much, and that really bothered me. I just think it was the fact that being men, perhaps they didn't want to show their emotion as much. So I made it a point to talk to my children. They were very young at the time, and I told them lots of stories and memories about their grandmother. I also had my husband share many memories and stories, and I think this really helped him to open up and think about her more often and talk about her more often. In my own grief journey, I have always turned to my faith. The minute I learned my sister had died, I immediately turned to God. I have always been able to turn to God. I grew up Catholic and learned about heaven and the promise that God made to us, that we would rise up after our death and be together. I even believe that one of my dear grandmothers was a saint. I believe in the saints. I have a strong devotion to our Mother Mary. I turn to her as well, for she has experienced grief herself, especially when it came to her son Jesus. She actually lost him twice, the first time when he was crucified, and the second time when he ascended into heaven, and she was no longer going to be able to spend time with him on earth. She had to have felt very sad again to lose him that way. I have always asked her to pray for me and to intercede on our behalf. I find great strength in the rosary. I say a rosary every day. I found it very interesting that a year ago, right after my sister passed, it was my birthday. And typically Tim and I don't exchange birthday gifts. But on that day, on my birthday, he gave me a gift. I was quite surprised, and when I opened it, it was a rosary. It was this rosary. A few weeks prior, he had a friend make this rosary for me. Each decade is the birthstone of my birthday, or the month we were married, and our two sons' birthstones. It just really surprised me, and I just loved it. Later that same day, the doorbell rings, and it's the UPS man, and he brings me a package. And again, typically, my siblings and I never exchanged gifts. So this gift was from my family, and it was a rosary. And they had collaborated on this several weeks before my birthday. And each color represents birthstones of myself and Tim and our boys. So I just found that very interesting that I get two rosaries. I think that's either a message from God, or as some people say, a coincidence, but I call it a God incidence. So now, of course, these rosaries are very special to me. Each decade is dedicated to someone in particular, and usually the third decade that I say is dedicated to all those that I say I will pray for. I love to pray for people, and I guess I get asked often if I will pray. I like the symbols of our Catholic faith, the statues, the stained glass windows, the candles, the tabernacle. I usually light a candle every week with special intentions. I often will come to church during the day and just sit in the quiet. There is something very comforting being in the quiet darkness of a church. Many times I have just sat and cried before the crucifix and have asked God to give me strength and to remind me that all will be okay. I, of course, love the Mass as well, and it is a very important part of my faith journey. There is great power in the Mass, especially with the Eucharist. At each Mass, I tend to get emotional, and I really feel that that is when the Holy Spirit is working on me. I want to get to heaven, and I want to see my loved ones again. I often ask God to provide a message or a sign about my loved ones. I know in the Bible, dreams were very often used by God to communicate his messages. I have had 4 dreams about my sister Jerry Lynn, and in each of them she was beautiful, very happy, and always smiling. This has brought me great comfort. Jerry Lynn and I would often boast to one another about finding money on the ground. We would call each other up and say, "Guess what I found?" We would talk about our big find, a penny, a nickel, a dime, a quarter. One day she called and said, "Guess what? I found a $100 bill." I, of course, thought she was joking. She said, "No, really. It was in the hedge along the front of our house." She said, "I couldn't believe it, but I thought, what if the neighbors lost it?" She said her neighbors were an elderly couple and thought, what if it blew out of their hands? Jerry Lynn lived in Laramie, Wyoming, and she hated the wind. So she just knew this could have easily happened. Being the always kind, considerate person my sister was, she knocked on the elderly neighbor's door and asked if they had lost the money. They had not. And so, as she stated, she scored big. After that, I just knew I could never top that find. We continued, though, to boast about our finds. So now I'll say to myself, Jerry Lynn, I could sure use a message. And while I'm out and about, more often than not, I will find a coin on the ground. I will just look up and say, Jerry Lynn, I know that was you. The other day I heard an interesting take about finding a coin. Each coin contains the words, "In God we trust." So now when I find a coin, I'll look up and say, Jerry Lynn, thank you for your message. But now I also say, God, I trust you. Most days I find myself doing okay. I try to focus on the memories and the good times and the laughs. I stand firm on the belief that we will meet again. I stand firm that she is in a better place, basking in the glory of our Lord. Jerry Lynn was an extremely kind person. She worked for a small vo-tech type college and basically considered a mother to many of the students. They would come to her with their needs or their heartaches or missing their home. She always went out of her way to loan them money, listen to their problems, and help them in any way they could. She was given an honor a few years ago as Employee of the Year. That in itself spoke to the type of employee and person that she was. I want to honor her memory by being the person that she was, extending kindness to anyone she met. Jerry Lynn never met a stranger and absolutely never judged anyone. She would always say, we never know what they're going through. When I am having a bad day, thinking of her, remembering her, missing talking with her or texting her, sending joke emails, or teasing her about her hate for spiders, this is when I make plans to help someone else. This is when I may write a card to someone or call someone or just conduct a random act of kindness in her memory. I vow to keep moving forward. Some days I move forward well, and others I can find myself very sad. I have meltdowns over the simple things. Jerry Lynn absolutely loved boxer dogs. She always had a boxer for a pet. Even when she passed, she owned a boxer. So just me seeing a boxer and a dog in someone's car or in a yard can set off my emotions. This is when I talk to God. This is when I reach out to Mother Mary, and in that moment, ask them to give me strength. I have a journal where I write down my thoughts and feelings. I will write down memories or thoughts. I love quotes and various sayings. In my journal, I will write down my prayers, thoughts, and feelings. I have found this to be very helpful, especially when I go back and read what I have written from a few months ago, last year. I can see where I have grown and where I have found strength. The strength I find is always in my prayers and my conversations with God. I love nature and the beauty of our world. I will see my sister in the sunrises and in the sunsets, in the stages of the moon and in the beauty of the seasons. We have lived in our home for over 32 years, and this past summer was the first time I had ever seen a cardinal in our neighborhood. This cardinal was loud. He would sing early in the morning and early in the evening. Whenever I heard the cardinal, I would say, "Hello, Jerry Lynn." I even saw this cardinal walking along the neighbor's fence. Right at that moment, I'm looking out my kitchen window, and there's the cardinal, and he stops. And he actually sat there for a few moments. I felt like that was a sign. I felt like that was my sister. The cardinal stayed all summer long and then left. So I hope he shows up again this spring. I again want to emphasize that each of us lives with our grief differently. I look around and I see so many people carrying on, forging on with life. I see them smiling and feeling happy and feeling joy. Sometimes I see people struggling and taking longer to move ahead. And all of that is okay. Again, there are no rules. Some of us take forever, some of us get stuck, and some of us even seem to only be able to take baby steps. We crawl, and then we run into moving forward. In the initial days of grief, after my sister passed, I felt that the sadness would never go away. And it really doesn't go away. It just doesn't come up as often or as intense. I think and remember my sister every single day. I do because I remember her and I pray for her every day. I ask God to reveal to me that she is with him. I ask him to give me signs and dreams. I told my brother-in-law Steve, Jerry Lynn's husband, that I experienced grief in the likeness of the waves on a beach. Initially, when my sister died, the waves were literally crashing in on me. They were knocking me down, pulling me out to sea, and making me feel disoriented. I have found with time and lots of prayer that the waves still come, but I feel much more prepared for them, and they come with less intensity. That doesn't mean to minimize my loss, but I feel I've been more prepared to deal with the oncoming waves. I can sense the waves coming, so I prepare for them. I may put on a life preserver to help me with the wave, in case it looks like a big one. In my case, my life preserver is my God and my faith. Basically, I wear my life preserver at all times because the waves can come at any time, no matter how long it has been since my loss. Last year, of course, I didn't feel up to Christmas at all. I didn't do one single thing for Christmas. I just figured out I don't have it in me and I'm not going to decorate. I didn't do one thing. So this year came around and I thought kind of the same thing. I just wasn't feeling it. I didn't plan on doing anything, and then I stopped and thought, I loved Christmas, especially having the Christmas tree lights on at night with all the rest of the home lights off and just looking at the Christmas tree. And I thought, come on, Karen, you've got to do a little something. So I just got out a little 4-foot tree and put some lights on it and got out one of my favorite nativities and put it on a small table. And that was the extent of my decorating. but it was a small baby step. So I think, to me, the key is to keep moving forward and to do it in your own way and in your own time, but to keep moving forward. God will answer our prayers, but God is waiting for us to also and make a move, to do something. There's a story of a couple little sisters that walked to school every day, and it seemed like more often than not they were late to school. Finally, the teacher said, "If you girls are late one more time and you don't get here until after the bell rings, I'm going to have to call your parents. It's very important that you get to school before the bell rings." So in the next few days, the little girls were walking to school, realizing they just might be late. So the one sister said, "I have an idea. Let's just stop right here and get on our knees and let's just pray. And let's just ask God that that bell doesn't ring." The other sister said, "I have a better idea. Why don't we start running to school, and while we're running, let's pray that that bell doesn't ring." We have to keep moving forward, even if it's tiny little baby steps. Thank you.